Welcome back to Let's Code. I'm Chris Biscardi, and today, on this rainy day, for me anyway, I don't know if it's raining by you, we've got Leptos. Leptos is a young enough web framework to actually not have a website currently, as far as I can tell. So we're going to be spending most of our time inside of the GitHub repo. Their self-description is build fast web applications with Rust, which is pretty much the same kind of description that you get from any web framework in any language. Web frameworks just, don't describe themselves as being slow or anything else. Now, Leptos is fairly young, and there is a note here that says that they are keeping it in not just the 0.x lifecycle, but the 0.0.x lifecycle. So they're saying that it's not even ready for a 0.1.0 release, which is totally fine for me because I love experimental software. But there may be significant missing documentation or features, and we can't consider any of the APIs that they have to be necessarily stable. So Leptos is being used in their own applications or the maintainer's own applications, but it's not a fully public release yet, I suppose, is the way to put that. Or rather, to reframe this, if you use Leptos, be ready to commit code in pull requests if something goes wrong. Leptos itself is kind of another solid.js based framework. So what we end up with here is something that looks incredibly similar to Sycamore. In this case, the simple counter example has a component macro that I kind of like here. So we have this function called simple counter, which becomes our component. Down in the main function, we've got this mount to body function. It takes the context or the scope, however you want to pronounce that, in the same way that Sycamore does, and has a view macro in the same way that Sycamore does, which you pass that scope into. And then we can just use simple counter as effectively HTML, which is the part that I really like about Leptos. So if we look back up, we can see that we accept the scope as CX in our simple counter component. And one of the props initial value, which is an I32, is defined as the next argument. So here, when we're passing in the props, we can pass in initial value equals 3, and that is represented up here as well. We're returning elements here instead of an HTML trait implementing generic. So the function signature here gets a little simpler as well. I don't really have a problem with the way that Sycamore or whatever do a generic here and then return the generic implementing HTML. But it is nice, especially if you're working with newer programmers or people who are new to a specific area of Rust, to have fewer generics and fewer lifetimes and things like that. So I really appreciate the simple signature from that perspective. In the same way that we can create signals in Sycamore or anything else, we can create signals in Leptos. So we pass in the context, we get the initial value, and then we get the value and a setter in this case. The event handler definitions are significantly more Rust syntax based, in my opinion. So instead of having a wrapper here that is a callback that we're calling new, that we're passing a move closure into, like we've seen in some other frameworks, all we have to do here is define the closure that we're going to use and then write the body of the closure. And I really like this reduction of boilerplate from other examples that we've seen in the past in our UI explorations in Rust, because it makes this like 3 lines, right? So you've got clear, and you can set a value to 0. You can decrement, which sets the value, which has an update function associated with it. So we grab the value from that closure and we make some modification to it. Same thing for increment. And then down in our view macro, we actually get like almost a full JSX syntax, which I really enjoy. It does say that the JSX is compiled to an HTML template string for performance. As a user, it doesn't particularly matter to me whether this compiles to functions like it does in like JavaScript's React, for example, or an HTML template string. Like that functionally doesn't matter to me that much at the moment. So this compiling to an HTML template string is fine. I just like the fact that there's the possibility that I can go work on something in a code sandbox or some other playground. I can write some HTML. I could copy an example out of some documentation and I can drop it in here and it will mostly work, right? Like the on-click handlers will need to be changed because this is not how you write an on-click handler in JavaScript or whatever. But the structure of the HTML is retained. So while I appreciate the constraints that lead to some of the other web frameworks that we've looked at using struct-like definitions here, I do think that if you are targeting the web platform, that choosing a representation in this macro for the rendering of these elements that looks closer to HTML benefits you in quite a few different ways. And you can also see in this macro that there's no reason to, or there's no need to wrap our strings inside of curly braces. So there's a lot less visual noise for the values that we're passing into, say, our buttons here. But we are using the value that we set up in our signal earlier using a closure with a move keyword at the front instead of just using the value itself, which is an interesting thing to note. So later on in the README, Leptos has a larger explanation of what it is and also specifically how it compares to Sycamore, because as we've seen, it uses a lot of the same idioms. So they describe Leptos as a full stack isomorphic Rust web framework that leverages fine-grained reactivity to build declarative user interfaces. And breaking this down, what this means is that you can use Leptos in a browser or on the server or to render static HTML. The reactivity part is those signals that we've been seeing, and the declarative user interfaces are, our component structure, basically. Notably, in comparison to Sycamore, which I haven't seen this for, somebody asked me on the Perseus video whether Perseus supports HTTP streaming of server-side rendered responses, and I couldn't find that support anywhere in the Perseus docs. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it's just that I couldn't find it. So Leptos is saying that they support HTTP streaming both for data and for HTML. So you can do out-of-order HTML chunk streaming into the browser through a server render process, which is useful for things like suspense components when you have to load data on the server and then you're rendering some HTML later, but you can render a lot of HTML now. Isomorphic is a word that we used to use to describe a application that could run, say, in the browser and on the server. The JavaScript community has since moved on from this word, so I would probably remove it from the documentation here because I don't think it has a lot of meaning outside of that particular context. The word that you might be more familiar with from the JavaScript ecosystem would be universal. So JavaScript that can run in many different contexts would be the implication there, because it ends up being not just, say, browser and server, but browser and server and in tests against a fake DOM implementation and in arbitrary edge compute layers or things like that, as well as headless browsers and whatever other integration testing fake environments that you have. I will say that the JavaScript community has even moved on even further, and you can render things in, say, a terminal, for example, which is neither browser nor server, but rather a third thing. So I've also noticed that in the README they describe, can you use Leptos to render kind of like native UI instead of web UI? And you can. So I would probably describe this more with the more modern terminology of universal rather than isomorphic. Leptos says they have a focus on the web platform and web standards. So doing things like links and forms are things that Leptos tries to build on top of rather than replace. We'll see how that pans out when we go into the deeper examples, which will be in a different video. The framework itself provides the reactive system, so all the places that you can put your state and things like that. The templating library, so the way that we actually get our HTML rendered and inserted into the DOM. And they also say they have a router. Sycamore also has a router, but it's interesting to note that Sycamore's router isn't used by Perseus, the higher level meta framework on top of Sycamore. They also call out that they don't use a virtual DOM, and specifically what they mean by that is that you get this very fine-grained reactivity rather than matching virtual DOM trees and having to diff against a larger data structure. Instead of doing that larger diff, you can do something much smaller and much more fine-grained, like toggling a single class or removing a single element from the DOM. And then there's some guide documentation that isn't built yet. The API documentation is in progress, but there are a bunch of examples. And in true Rust project form, they have quite a few examples. So it's worth taking a look at that if you want to take a dive into Leptos. There's a note about using nightly here. And I just wanted to point out that yes, Leptos requires nightly, and it requires nightly to get rid of the .get, .set, etc., like boilerplate that we saw in Sycamore. But Sycamore could also support this if they wanted to. They would just also have to tie to nightly. So while Leptos has decided to commit to this, Sycamore has decided to wait for this. I'm not going to open the benchmarks. I am extremely hesitant and skeptical to share benchmarks. If you are a person who is interested in numbers, go look at the numbers, go look at the benchmarks. But I think that it's incredibly hard to generate a benchmark that would apply to your real world project. And that if you are concerned about performance in a given way, that the best thing that you can do is write a real world minimal example of your project in particular and benchmark that specifically rather than any of these more micro benchmarky kinds of things that the JavaScript ecosystem has popularized. Can you use this for native GUI? Yes, you can use the reactive system to build on top of a native GUI system. And there's even an example using GTK, but it may not be the easiest thing for you to do. And then they have two sections for how it's different from Vue.axis and then how it's different from Sycamore. I think it's more obvious that this is different than Vue because Vue is built around the concept of the virtual DOM and less fine-grained reactivity, less solid JS-y, while Vue skews more towards the class and functional separation that React uses. So on the functional side, Vue uses hooks, and on the class side, you kind of get trait implementation or structs as your components, which maps a little bit to the React class model a little bit more. Leptos tries to do components, but also tries to take a slightly different approach to how you manage your state and how you manage that reactivity. But more interestingly, I think, because it's obvious that Leptos and reactivity, fine-grained reactivity, is different than the way that React and Vue do things. More interestingly, the differences between Sycamore and Leptos for why you would want to choose one of those two libraries is a lot closer. So first of all, Sycamore is more mature. It's been around longer. It has Perseus built on top of it. It has more documentation in general. So if you care about having a slightly larger ecosystem, you might want to look more at Sycamore and Perseus than Leptos. Again, the templating that we talked about earlier, Leptos uses that JSX-like approach, whereas Sycamore uses something else, is the way that I'll put it. Leptos's Vue macro compiles to HTML templates, which are a real thing. And cloning templates apparently is significantly faster than doing create element. I haven't worked too much with frameworks that do template clones in practice, so I don't have personal experience to share for whether that has a real influence on the way that the site behaves. But again, we've removed the virtual DOM and we are focusing quite a bit on the performance of smaller grained updates when it comes to Leptos and the choices they've made around what the Vue macro actually does and compiles to. Leptos also says they enforce read-write segregation. So I didn't realize that Sycamore didn't do this. And I guess what they mean by this, I've brought up the Sycamore docs on the right so we can see this, is that when you use a signal inside of Leptos, you end up with much more of a use effect-y or use state-y kind of function signature. So you get let count and set count, which is the read-write separation, rather than getting just the full signal in the Sycamore example. So in create signal and Sycamore, you just get the signal and then you have to do .get, .set, whatever. But inside of Leptos, it looks like you get the getter and the setter as different things inside of this tuple. So we could do let signal equals create signal, but we can also do the destructuring and the getter is count and the setter is set count. I actually do like that mental model quite a bit. I do really like that aspect of hooks. I just think that the implementation of hooks in Vue when we went through it was a little bit cumbersome and not necessarily for reasons that were unsolvable. And finally, in Leptos, signals are functions. So instead of having count.get, which is one of the things that I mentioned in the Sycamore video that I felt created a lot of noise in the program itself, we were doing .get anytime we needed to get that value. In Leptos, the signals are functions. So you can just call count on that getter. Again, the create signal gives us like this getter on the left and the setter on the right. We can think of it like that. So if we want to get the value from the count, we can just call count. And finally, in Leptos, signals and scopes are both static, or they have static lifetimes. And the impact of this is that by making signals trivially clonable or trivially copyable, because they will implement copy, we can get rid of the ownership issue where, if you remember in the view video, we did a lot of this kind of thing where it was kind of like let count equals count.clone, and then that got moved into a closure, and then we did it again for let count equals count.clone, and then we moved it into another closure. And we did this kind of like every time we defined a closure inside of a use effect hook or inside of a handle or inside of that use effect hook or something like that. And it added quite a bit of visual noise to the program. But in Leptos and apparently Sycamore, the signals and the scopes are copy, or they implement the copy trait, and the lifetimes are static, which means that we don't have to do this clone before we move them into functions. So if we look back at the example up here, this set value gets copied in here. So we don't have to do a clone before clear and a clone before decrement and a clone before increment to pass different values in to each of these function handlers, which results in a much sort of more concise visual representation of what's going on here. Now, it may not be realistic to have 3 things declared like this on 3 lines because you probably are doing more logic than that, but it is a nice developer experience improvement. I'll leave it at that with Leptos. I think it's really interesting. There's a bunch of examples in the repo that I think we should go over. Of course, they also have the to-do MVC example, so we should look into that. But I also want to look into what it is to server-side render, because I am looking into doing a larger real-world project. And the thing drawing me currently to Perseus is their support for doing static rendering in addition to server-side rendering. So I'm curious to see if there's anything like that in Leptos, because I do like a decent amount of the choices they made here around what it feels like to write this code. So that's Leptos. It's another video in our evaluation of Rust and WASM web frameworks. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. If you like the video, and I will catch you in the next one. Have a great day.